All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is daily vlog number, I think we're at 213 now. Math is hard for folks. So, today, there has been a growing discontent in the world of Eorzea. People are complaining about the difficulty of the dungeon and raid content in the Dawn Trail. And it got me thinking, first of all, I'd like to talk about that, but it got me thinking about tabletop RPG game design and how to make challenging encounters in general that aren't just big dude with a lot of hit points hits really, really hard. So I thought we could kind of combine both of those ideas to have a discussion just about what is the difference between what I would consider hard content and challenging content. So, yeah, and in both realms of video games and to the tabletop RPGs. So, let's start off by talking about what is hard versus challenging. In my definition, which this is entirely based on my own personal opinion, this is not an official definition or anything, but going forward in this discussion, this is what I'm going to mean by hard. Hard difficulty is exactly that. It's just very, very difficult to get through, seemingly for no reason. I would consider something hard if, like, let's say a goblin normally has 10 hit points and does 5 points of damage when it attacks. Use easy numbers. The hard version of the goblin would have 20 hit points and do 10 points of damage. Nothing about a hard mode goblin is difficult. They just hit harder and are harder to kill. So to me, that's what hard content is they just make it take longer and make it more difficult by upping numbers and things like that. So the fight itself is exactly the same. It just takes longer and is far more punishing. That's what I consider hard content. When I talk about challenging content, to me, that's something like, okay, let's do our normal goblin. Normal goblin, again, 10 hit points, does 5 points of damage. A challenging combat would be, well, let's take the goblin and clone it. So instead of just having one goblin, you now have two. They have the same roughly amount of hit points. It's just spread out amongst the two things, and they get to attack twice as often. To me, that is challenging content, because a fight with a single goblin versus a fight with two half goblins fundamentally play differently. And it's not that it's going to take longer, it's going to require you to play your character differently. Because while you might have a character that can come up and just one-shot the goblin with 10 hit points, it's not going to have a difficulty one-shotting a half-goblin with 5 hit points. However, it can't end that encounter with one attack. So now you have to start deciding, okay, well, do I have area of attacks? And that also means for the game designer that you can adjust the difficulty of the encounter by simply doing things like spreading them out. You know, if you don't want a single character to be able to end it with a single attack, you leave the same hit point pool roughly, but by splitting them up and giving them more attacks, it changes how the things work, and it forces you to be more creative and do things differently than just, oh, it's the same exact fight, it's just longer and hurts more. So those are two extremely simplistic explanations of what I'm talking about. But that's what that's the discussion I'd like to have today. The difference between hard content and challenging content. So we're going to start with Final Fantasy XIV. So if you've never played an MMO before, excuse me, I got something in my throat. It's driving me nuts. Okay, so if you've never played an MMO before, something that I think just about every MMO I have ever played has is group content. That's kind of the point of MMOs in general, the massively multiplayer aspect of it. You have group content, and for the longest time, they've just been called dungeons. Now, each game calls them something different, but most of the people in the community just call them dungeons and raids. Dungeons are for a single group. Raids are for multiple groups. That's the terminology we're dealing with. And the way that the vast majority of MMOs make challenging content is your normal rank and file baddies will literally run up to you, attack you, and you attack them back until they're dead. They may have some special things, like maybe you have to attack them at certain times or from certain angles, or sometimes they'll have area of effects that you have to move out of, but they're relatively simplistic. When you get to boss content, the kind of industry standard for making tough boss content or making challenging boss content is the boss will telegraph that they're about to do some sort of an attack in a particular place. And the player's job is to make sure either they are not standing in that place if it's a bad place, or they are standing in that place if it's a good place. And that's kind of like, you can boil down like 99% of boss mechanics and raid mechanics in almost every single MMO to just stand in the right spot or don't stand in the right spot. And they make variations on that, things like sometimes they won't mark the spot on the map and you have to watch the boss to figure out where it's going to be. Or sometimes it'll be, things like you can't stand this close to another person, or there'll be forced movement. So you have to make sure not only you're standing in the right spot, but that once the forced movement happens, you're still standing in the right spot. Stuff like that. But the vast majority of it is still either stand in the right place or don't stand in the right place while you're also doing damage. So when we're talking about Final Fantasy XIV, there's a few things that have existed for years now. I don't think I know they didn't exist in the original version. And I think a lot of them didn't really exist in A Realm Reborn. They only started showing up in Heaven's Word, which is the first expansion, and then started getting more defined. But those kind of three basic things are: don't stand in red. There will be some area on the map that glows red or yellow or something that indicates you don't want to stand there. And bosses will have different shapes for those, but for the most part, it's don't stand in red. The second one is called Tank Busters. Tank Busters are just really, really powerful attacks that all tanks have abilities that reduce the amount of damage that they take. And so the way that you deal with a Tank Buster is you activate one of your damage mitigation abilities, and depending on the Tank Buster, you might need to also move, because sometimes Tank Busters have area of effects around them, but that's what it is. The third kind of basic Final Fantasy XIV thing you have to watch out for is everybody stack. Basically, there will be this big flashing mark above one of the DPS. It's never on the tank. One of the DPS will have this big kind of arrow with like a channel next to it. And what that means is everyone needs to stand on top of that character. They all need to stand in the same spot, because for each, the attack itself does a set amount of damage divided by how many characters there are. So if only one character is there, it takes all the damage, and it's normally enough to one-shot a DPS. But if everybody's standing there, it divides the damage by 4, and it spreads it out amongst, like, the tank, who has a crap ton of hit points and a bunch of damage mitigation stuff. So, significantly easier to deal with. And that, for the most part, is all you need to know to... sorry, there was something floating around. It's all you need to know to run most Final Fantasy XIV content. Pretty simple, pretty basic. Fast forward a decade, we have Dawn Trail. And what they've done is they like to mix and match a bunch of different things, and they've made some variations. One of the one that's really, really common in Dawn Trail is they will have multi-level attacks. And basically what that is, or multi-stage attacks, there we go. Basically what that is it will show you, hey, don't stand here, then don't stand here, then don't stand here. And it will flash all 3 of those in order, but then they'll just go away. And you have to kind of remember where it is that you're supposed to stand. And if you don't, bad things happen. It makes for a pretty interesting variation on the don't stand here, because now it's not don't stand in red, it's remember where the bad places are and move. Because generally what happens is the areas will overlap, so you can't just stand in one spot and miss all 3 attacks. You have to be moving along. Makes for very challenging content. I don't consider that hard content, because it's not just, well, we're going to make the area bigger so it's harder for you to get out of. Or we're going to make, if you stand in it, we're going to make it hit harder. That's hard content. Challenging content, we're going to go, well, you already know how to not stand in the bad place. Now, we're going to make you have to remember which bad place not to stand in at which time. So that's really, really common. In addition to that, they will mix in some more traditional don't stand here at the same time, where you will see the multi-stage one go boop, boop, boop. That's where you want to avoid. And then you will also see an area attack. And so you have to kind of figure out, okay, which one of these is going to trigger first? Because I have to make sure I'm standing in the right spot for when they trigger and which order they're in. Again, this is what I would consider challenging difficulty, not hard difficulty. Because again, it's forcing you to play differently than you normally would. And again, I actually really enjoy that stuff. Now, from what I understand, this overlapping mechanics thing and like time delays and stuff like that, that was stuff that used to be in what was called Savage or Extreme tier content. And that's basically the super hard stuff. Basically, there are always bosses that you can fight them. You fight them for the story, and then you can fight them again as many times as you want, but it's the same damn fight. Or you have the Savage mode, where it's the same monster, but they have a lot more hit points, and all of their attacks are different and hit harder. So it's kind of a combination between challenging and hard, because it is hard. All their stuff hits harder, and they have a lot more hit points. But it's also challenging, because they have different attack patterns, and you have to do different things, and you have to really understand what you're doing. And so people are complaining in the Final Fantasy XIV community that the Dawn Trail dungeons and raid series are basically the extreme mode stuff, but they're forcing regular players to play it, and they're going, that's not fair. And I don't really agree with that. Again, none of these fights are particularly hard. They're just challenging. And there are more varied mechanics and stuff like that. Like I have to give it to the Dawn Trail devs. As much as I was not a huge fan of the main story quest story, the dungeon content and the raid content is probably some of the most fun I've had in the game. Because the first time I did it, unbelievably frustrated. Because it would ask me to keep track of like 7 or 8 different things, while also playing the Viper, which is a very busy class as far as like when you have to push buttons and everything. There's basically a bunch of different combos that you have to kind of balance as to when you're using them, when you're not using them, and so Viper in and of itself is a very, very busy class. So I became very, very frustrated with it. And then it all clicked, and I realized that this is really, really fun content because I leveled my Viper from 80 to 90 just doing old content because it's the fastest way to level. And I got bored very, very quickly because I've done all this stuff hundreds of times. And the new stuff just doesn't get boring. And now I'm leveling my Gunbreaker so I can do the tank roll quests. And I'm realizing that these new mechanics are a lot of fun. And they require you to pay attention in a way that I just don't have to when I'm not doing them. So, yeah, I have not made it through the first raid series yet. I fought the first boss, which again, the first time I fought that boss, it was frustrating, and then every time I fought it since then, I just had fun. Because once you figure out how the mechanics work, and you stop, like, I have to force myself not to just stare at my ability bar to know that I'm pushing the buttons in the right order at the right time, especially when I'm playing Viper. Once I learned to look away from my ability bar, I had a lot of fun. So translating that to tabletop RPGs and what is hard combat design versus challenging combat design in tabletop RPGs. Well, let's look at something as simple as a dragon fight versus a beholder fight. In my humble opinion, dragon fights are hard in Dungeons and Dragons. Beholder fights are challenging for both players and dungeon masters. And this is what I mean. Dragons, there are like 4 or 5 different flavors of each dragon. You have the young, you have the adult. There's what is it? Here, I have the damn... I can look it up because I have all of it on my computer. Say what you want about D&D Beyond, but it's very, very useful to have everything there. So give me... Did I really do the DMG? I don't want the DMG. I want the Monster Manual. Monster Manual. Okay, so D for Dragon. Dragons. Okay. So I just have to remember how this works. Okay, so it's 4 levels of dragons. You have wormlings, young, adult, and ancient. And when you look at what they can do, for the most part, they're the same fight, just more hit points and their stuff does more damage. Like a black dragon wormling. Armor class is 17, hit points 33. It has 2 attacks. A bite attack, which does 7 piercing damage and 2 acid damage. And it's acid breath, which is a 15-foot line that you have to make a dex save. You take 22 acid damage on a failed save, half as much on a success. We move up to young. They technically add another attack, but it's really not that different. Armor class goes up to 18, so increases by 1. Hit points, 127, so that's what? 4? Roughly 4 times, a little over 4 times more hit points. And then it can multi-attack. It makes 3 attacks, 1 with its bite, 2 with its claws. So bite now does 15 piercing damage instead of 7, so a little over double. And then the claws each do 11 slashing damage. Oh, 15 piercing and 4 acid. So, and then their acid breath is a 30-foot line, so a little bit bigger, and 49 acid damage. So, as far as fighting a black dragon wormling versus a young black dragon, there's not really a difference as far as how you approach them. Don't let them hit you with the acid breath. Don't let them attack you, or if they do attack you, find ways to mitigate that in some way and then get rid of their hit points. When we move up to the adult Black Dragon, they do add something to make it more challenging than just harder, but it's still armor class 19, hit points 195, so it's not as big a jump as Wormling to Young. They add legendary resistance and legendary actions, which is just how high-level D&D monsters work. And then their multi-attack still makes 3 attacks. The attacks do a little bit more damage. But it also has a frightful presence, which is basically make a wisdom save or become frightened, and once you make your wisdom save, you're immune to it for the rest of existence because you're probably not going to be fighting this particular adult Black Dragon again. So other than the fact that it can scare you once, there's not a whole lot of difference between an adult Black Dragon and a young Black Dragon. And again, running them as a DM, it's really, when do I use the Acid Breath? And who do I focus on with the attacks? And that's really it. Even with the legendary actions, they can make a tail attack, so just another attack. Or wing attack is technically a little bit more challenging because it adds an area attack plus it can knock you prone. And then when we go to the ancient version, it's literally the identical thing with just higher numbers. It goes up to 22 AC, hit points are 367, so it's almost, almost double the hit points. But it still makes 3 attacks. 1 bite, 2 claws. It has a tail for its legendary actions as Frightful Presence, Acid Breath. So to me, dragon attacks in general in the D&D are hard. Because even comparing them to like regular creatures, really all you have here is they have multi-attack and they have an area attack that can be kind of devastating, and they can fly. That's really about it. It's a really simple, as much as the Dungeons and Dragons, they put this huge emphasis on dragons. Dragons are not particularly complex creatures to fight. Other than, again, the flying mechanic can cause some issues. The thing that makes them challenging is going to be how the DM runs them, and there's not a whole lot of things that you can do that are going to change things that much. Now, this is the original Monster Manual version. I think when they released Monsters of the Multiverse, they had some new stuff as far as dragons were concerned. So I'm going to just look real quick to see if I can find Dragon. Dragoloth. No, they don't even have dragons in here. You know what I could probably do? I could probably go look in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons and think maybe that's where they would have updated the dragons. So let's look at the black dragons there and see what they do to change them from hard to adventures, connected creatures, black dragon layers. That's another thing that I guess we don't really talk about is layer actions and things like that are very important as far as creating interesting encounters. Yeah, and then the actual dragons here, they introduced new dragons, but it's not like they redid the black dragon. So, okay. So anyway, fighting just a dragon itself is a hard encounter in D&D. It's a lot of hit points. They do a lot of damage. That's what makes it difficult. But it's not particularly challenging. Find ways to avoid getting hit. Kill them as fast as you can. That's what it is. When we look at something like a beholder, that is a very, very different situation, because beholders have a lot of different things that they can do. They're something I think a lot of people are not aware of. Beholders are remarkably slow. They have a fly speed of 20 feet, and that's it. But because of all the different eye rays that they have, and the fact that they can bite as well, and they have legendary actions, a beholder is a challenging fight because there's so many things built in the beholder that makes them very challenging to fight. First things first, the anti-magic cone. If the beholder is looking at you, not only can you not cast magic spells at it, but all of your magic items are mundane as long as the cone is looking at you. So that adds an interesting aspect where you have to position your characters in ways that they're not going to get hit by this cone, especially if you are a heavily magic-focused character. Now, the downside of the anti-magic cone is the beholder's eye rays can't affect anything inside the cone. However, there's a very simple way around this. Because the beholder has all these different eye stalks, they can see any direction that they want. So all they have to do is look somewhere else with their main eye, fire their rays, and then turn it back. There's nothing in the rules that prevent that. There's nothing in here that says that the beholder has to be looking with their main eye to be able to hit anything. So that creates challenging aspects for the players because it's forcing them to play their characters in a different way. They can't just go, okay, well, I'm going to just pepper them with Eldritch Blasts and Fireballs, because the beholder can deal with that really well. In addition to that, each one of the eye rays does something different and potentially deadly stuff. If you've never dealt with a beholder before, your classic standard beholder, of which there are many varieties, but your classic standard beholder has 10 eye rays. Charm Ray, Paralyzing Ray, Fear Ray, Slowing Ray, Enervation Ray, Telekinetic Ray, Sleep Ray, Petrification Ray, Disintegration Ray, and Death Ray. Every one of these, for the most part, the players are required to respond in a different way. Charm Ray, it's a wisdom save, and a lot of people don't understand how the charm condition works. A charmed creature can't attack the charmer or target the charmer with harmful abilities or magical effects. The charmer has advantage on any ability checks to interact socially with the creature. Effectively, if you are charmed by a creature in general in the D&D 5th edition, you're not mind controlled by them. That's domination. Charmed is very, very simply, you consider them a really, really good friend and will not actively do something to hurt them in some way, shape, or form. So when players have to deal with a Charm Ray, there's a bunch of different ways that a Charm Ray can be exceptionally effective. One of the ones that most people think about is you charm the Barbarian. Barbarians, big, strong dudes, big, heavy axe. They do lots and lots of damage. So you charm the Barbarian, you take away one of their DPS, and that is a viable way to do it. You want to know an even better way to piss off your players? Charm the Cleric. Why? Why does charming the Cleric? Because then the Cleric can blow their high-level healing spells on the beholder. There is nothing more fun than burning a really high-level spell slot, or forcing a player to burn a really high-level spell slot that they would like to save for their own party on something that's completely pointless. And because, again, with the Charm Ray, one of the things that Charm can do, the Charmer has advantage on any ability check to interact socially with the creature. They're trying to convince them, no, I really, you probably won't be able to convince the Cleric to bring down a meteor swarm or something, or a pillar of flame on their own party. But you could probably pretty easily convince them, oh, these people are hurting me. I know they're your friends, but please just heal me. Or, oh no, the ceiling looks like it's about to cave in. The only thing that'll stop it is, what if there was a pillar of fire that just melted the ceiling together so you don't have to worry about it falling and killing your friends? I'm trying to help you. That is a challenging encounter because it's not just lots of hit points. This is an interesting situation that forces the players to think differently. Paralyzing Ray. That one is a pretty simple thing. Not only does paralysis take you out of combat for a little bit, but it does things like you auto-fail strength and dexterity checks. So things like the Death Ray, which requires a dexterity saving throw, you auto-fail your strength and dex saves. So paralyzing someone and then hitting them with either a disintegration or a Death Ray can be devastating, especially if it's something like a rogue where with their evasion skill, they can take 0 damage from those because they're dexterity saves. But the paralyzing ray is a constitution save, which is not something that rogues tend to be particularly skilled at. So I'm not going to go through every single one of the rays here, but that's what I want when I'm talking about challenging in-kick encounters. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. This is not just withstand the damage, do more damage than them. This requires them to come up with interesting ways to deal with paralysis, to deal with the anti-magic cone, to deal with the charm effect. Things like the disintegration ray. If you're using cover to prevent getting hit by the rays, the disintegration ray can just destroy the cover that you're using. So again, I consider a beholder a challenging encounter. I consider a dragon, at least the standard dragons in the 2014 Monster Manual, to be hard encounters. So what can we do in tabletop RPG game design that we might be able to learn from Final Fantasy XIV as well to create challenging combat as opposed to hard combat? Well, I have not been able to pick it up as of yet. But I'm planning once the actual core rulebook for the Final Fantasy XIV tabletop RPG comes out, I'm planning to pick it up because I have read the free rules that are out there. They don't have any character classes or anything, but they do explain how the game is played. One of the things they talk about there is basically how they translated telegraphing attacks into a tabletop RPG, because a lot of things that work in MMOs don't work in tabletop RPGs. One of the ones that I'm most, and I think I've talked about this before, the idea of combo attacks in tabletop or in video games, like Final Fantasy XIV, the global cooldown is like a little over 2 seconds. So if you want to do a 3-attack combo where you have to do first attack, second attack, or third attack, the whole thing takes you 6 seconds. In a tabletop RPG, if you want to do a 3-attack kick a combo, and each attack takes you a single turn to do, it will take you, average round of combat, depending on how many players you have, is going to be a minimum of 10 to 15 minutes. If you have a large table, it may be 20 or 30 minutes between your turns. So in order to pull off a 3-attack combo in the shortest interval that we've talked about, let's just say that a single round of combat takes 10 minutes. It takes you half an hour to do a single combo. And on average, combat in D&D and most tabletop RPGs, to be fair, only lasts somewhere between 4 to 6 rounds. Your average combat is only going to last you 4 to 6 rounds. So in order to pull off a combo like that, you would only be able to do that twice in the entirety of the combat, and that's only if that is the only thing that you focus on. If you have to do anything else, if anything stops you from doing that combo, then you are only getting one combo off and then a couple other turns of doing something random. It's just not very fun. Same thing is true about like telegraphing moves and stuff like that. Because everything happens on a turn basis as opposed to in real time, telegraphing attacks gets really, really weird. Because either the telegraphs are small enough that literally anyone can move their character out of it before they get attacked and then they become completely pointless, or the attacks themselves are so large or so fast that people are never given a chance to react. Or even if they can react, they don't have enough movement or something to be able to get out of it. And so it feels like you're removing some player agency because you are doing something that makes them feel like they should be able to do something about it, but then there's nothing that they can do about it. So you're giving the illusion of choice there. So I have no idea how they deal with that in the Final Fantasy XIV TTRPG. But I'm planning on learning about it because it's a problem that I've seen a lot of people try to overcome, and just I haven't really found a good solution to it yet. I've seen a lot of different systems try and conquer the idea of telegraphed attacks, and the only one I think that's ever done it somewhat well, there is a board game called the Dark Souls board game. Came out around the same time that Dark Souls 3 came out, and so it was Dark Souls 3, the board game. And one of the interesting things about it was all of the enemies had a deck of cards that you would use to figure out what their next attack is. And each card would have a movement that they had to follow and an attack with specific areas that they would focus on. But the interesting thing about it was the decks themselves, they normally weren't very many cards. You might have 6 or 8 cards in a deck for a single boss encounter. And so the way that they worked is when you got to the end, you didn't reshuffle them. You literally just turned the deck over and started from the beginning again. So the boss patterns became predictable. You would have to watch them do it first, but once you'd seen it once, you knew what the next attack was going to be, and you could plan your way around it. And from a tabletop game perspective, that is a fantastically interesting mechanic, especially if you allow for shuffling and the things like that, so that every time you fight the same creature, it technically is going to have a different pattern because you can shuffle up when the things go. And some patterns are going to be more devastating than others, simply because maybe there's 2 really big area attacks right one after another, meaning that if you're close when it happens, you're kind of screwed. But then you have the rest of that rotation where there's no area attacks, and you can just go to town on them. So I think mechanics like that can create very challenging encounters, because then you can make attacks that are much more devastating to the players, but because they are predictable, it allows the players to be able to mitigate them in ways other than, well, I'm just going to heal this person, or I'm going to use a healing potion, or I'm going to uncanny dodge it, or something like that. You know, it allows them for that. The other thing that's actually built into D&D 5th edition, and I think a lot more systems need to start adding this, is the idea of layer actions. Layer actions are something that I see a lot of DMs either ignore or just forget about in D&D 5th edition, because they do make running encounters more complex. The basics of a layer action in D&D 5th edition is on certain initiative numbers. Generally, it's like it's done in either 5s or 10s, so like 20, 15, 10, 5, 0. And depending on how many layer actions, it might just be at initiative 20 it does this, initiative 10 it does this, initiative 0 it does this. And what they are is they are effectively kind of environmental things that happen, but they happen at set times in initiative. And it's one of the reasons why something like a beholder in its lair is actually a higher challenge rating. So normal beholder, challenge rating 13. A beholder in its lair has a challenge rating of 14, so it increases it by 1 level. And these are the lair actions. When fighting inside its lair, a beholder can invoke the ambient magic to take lair actions. On initiative count 20, losing to initiative ties, the beholder can take one lair action to cause one of the following effects. A 50-foot square of ground within blah blah becomes slimy, and that's difficult terrain. Walls within 120 feet of the beholder start growing arms. And then each creature of the beholder's choice that starts its turn within 10 feet of such wall must succeed on a dex save or be grappled. Or an eye opens on a solid surface within 60 feet of the beholder, and a random eye ray of the beholder shoots out from the eye at a target of the beholder's choice that it can see. The eye then closes and disappears. So, and then the thing, a beholder can't repeat any effect until they have all been used, and it can't use the same effect 2 rounds in a row. So, layer actions allow for more complexity in the combat encounter, and therefore more challenge. Creating areas of difficult terrain, creating if they're close to a wall, because they might be sticking close to a wall for a number of different reasons. If they're a monk, it's because they can run up the wall and do crazy monk shit. Everyone else, it might be that there's a pillar or something like that they're using as cover, and so now anywhere within 10 feet of a wall now can grapple you. Or just having a random eye beam shoot out is also a very useful thing. But the thing with layer actions is they happen on a schedule. Specifically for the beholder in the monster manual on initiative count 20, which is generally going to be either at the top of the initiative or near the top. These things can happen. Now, the thing with layer actions, for the most part, layer actions don't become a thing until late tier 2, and then tier 3 and tier 4 content. And most DMs don't play high-level D&D at all. So I know a lot of DMs that have just never used a creature with a layer action before. The other thing that's interesting is layer actions are not part of the stat block of the monster. They're generally included, like in the monster manual, it is right after the stat block, it says a beholder's lair, and it talks about layer actions. But if you're not reading the whole thing, you're just looking at stat blocks, you're never going to see layer actions. So when we're talking about tabletop RPGs as a whole, the idea of creating a challenging fight, I think one of the things that can add to the challenge of a fight without making it difficult is something akin to layer actions. Something that happens on a set schedule so the players can plan around it. That can be relatively devastating, but because of the planned aspect, it allows the players to be able to predict and work around it. And it's not something that comes from the boss itself. What I mean by that is, a lot of times, even if you want to have a really, really complex boss that does a lot of really, really cool things, if all the things have to originate from the boss, the easiest thing in the world to prevent you from getting hurt with those things is to put something that stops it from getting to you. A simple wall of stone will prevent half the eye rays, or I think all the eye rays, from hitting you. Like, it's the easiest thing in the world to do. Now, disintegration ray can get rid of it, but it has to waste an eye ray to do that. The thing with beholder eye rays is it's supposed to be random. I have run beholders where I've chosen the eye rays instead of rolling them. It's not quite as much fun, to be blunt. I enjoy the eye rays being random. So what you do is you roll a d10 and you re-roll any duplicates, because you can't use the same eye ray twice in one turn. So because of that, just putting up a wall, if it doesn't roll a 9, it's not getting rid of that wall. And again, beholder is remarkably slow. It can only move 20 feet a turn. unless it dashes, and if it dashes, it can't use any of its rays or any crazy shit like that. So the thing with layer actions is they allow for challenging things to happen that can't just be stopped by I hide behind this rock. Because they are part of the environment, you do actually have to pay attention to where your characters are standing, what they're doing. It does mean that for theater of the mind style combat, layer actions in and of themselves can become a little bit more complex and difficult to do because you can't. It's significantly easier to run layer actions when you have a map to look at. Yeah, that being said, I've said this many times before. I am not a skilled combat designer. The few combats that I've run that I've been relatively pleased about have not been challenging combats or hard combats. They've been entertaining combat encounters where the players enjoyed fighting them, but they weren't particularly difficult. They were invested in the fight for various reasons, and that's what made them fun. But they weren't difficult fights. So I've been trying to do my best to learn how to create more interesting, more challenging combat encounters by looking at a lot of different things, by reading new adventures and seeing how the pre-written adventures create challenging combat, by watching other dungeon masters and kind of dissecting their different combats and things like that. And then what I've been doing a lot more often is I'm looking at non-tabletop RPG inspirations to give me ideas about, well, how can I challenge my players that is not going to be something that, because I play for the most part, the people that I play with when they start playing with me, a lot of them are not veterans. Most of them are new to the hobby in general. But a lot of these people I've been playing with for 8 or 9 years now, or at least 5 or 6 years. And I'm not the only person that they play with. They've become veterans. They've experienced a lot of different things. Half of them are dungeon masters themselves now, and so they look and see what kind of interesting things that they could create. They're branching into different RPGs, which thrills me beyond measure. So coming up with things that they haven't experienced becomes more and more difficult. And again, I used to do the convention circuit where, again, I say this all the time just because it's a thing that I've really heard. And I don't think it's something that you hear really outside of like the Midwest or Wisconsin specifically, is the idea of, oh yeah, I used to play with Gary. If anyone doesn't know, Gary Gygax was the dude that invented D&D with the other person that I can never remember his name. And he created it in a town in southern Wisconsin called Lake Geneva. It's right on the Illinois border. And it's almost like if you don't know, Wisconsin is effectively looks like a hand. So you have like Milwaukee is like right here. You go up here, like this is where Green Bay is. Madison is like right here-ish. Lake Geneva is about like here. If we consider like my wrist, the border with Illinois down here, and you have like Chicago right over here. Lake Geneva is like right here. It's hard to see, but yeah, it's almost dead center. It's a little bit closer to the east than it is to the western border. But yeah, that's Lake Geneva, and that's where Gygax created D&D. That's where the first Gen Con convention was held. That's where Gary Con is held now. And it's still a pretty big place for D&D in general. So yeah, I have played with veterans, and finding ways to challenge veterans, especially veterans who've been playing since like the OD&D days, where things like the Tomb of Horrors was mind-blowing because it was a dungeon that was basically just designed to kill people, and that wasn't something that DMs really did. I mean, yeah, the adversarial DM thing was not a new experienced by that because it was, I think, the earlier late 80s the Tomb of Horrors came out. But a couple of the things, like the first challenge, slight spoiler alert for Tomb of Horrors. The first challenge you come up against is there is this large face with the mouth open. And the mouth is large enough that you can crawl inside. But it's completely dark, as if someone's cast a darkness spell or something on it. And so something that a lot of people had kind of learned to do is like, well, if there's a little tunnel, you have to explore it. Well, the thing about this is inside that mouth is a thing called a sphere of annihilation. Anything that makes contact with the sphere simply stops existing. And so you can instantly kill your character by just walking into the mouth. What was significantly more common is people would just reach in and they would come out without an arm. And that was normally enough damage to end that character's adventuring career, if not end the character outright. So things like that were interesting. But again, we're going back, 40 years that stuff like that has existed. So finding ways to challenge veterans or people that just play a lot. Maybe not, 50-year veterans, but people that just get a lot of chance to play and get to absorb a lot of different D&D and stuff like that is difficult. So, yeah. So I'm interested to hear from you guys. First of all, if you are a Final Fantasy XIV player, do you think the new content is too hard? Let me know in the comments down below. And do you have any ideas for maybe not just Final Fantasy XIV, but other video games or other things like that, how to translate stuff like that into tabletop RPGs as a way to create challenging encounters as opposed to hard encounters? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, and it's all for me today. I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.